we're going to do some negative testing now. This will also allow us to explore an alternate syntax available to use in the when-then block. Here's the code as it stands right now. We recently asked what would happen if we used a bad URL. Let's change the first URL to something we know doesn't exist. In this case, we'll change it to content-11 instead of content-1. Now let's see what happens. Content-2 and 3 loaded as we expected. Content-11 didn't load. Also, the proceed button was not enabled. We didn't get an error message. Although the first load failed, the remaining 2 loaded just fine. One thing about JavaScript coding, once an error occurs, nothing works beyond that point. So we obviously didn't get a JavaScript error while loading the first section. Otherwise, the remaining 2 wouldn't have loaded. The when-then block we're using says that when the 3 sections load, then remove the disabled attribute from the proceed button. There is nothing in that statement about what to do if we encounter a failure. That's a problem with our code, not a problem with the jQuery methods. There are actually a few ways we can address this. The first and simplest way is to attach an additional function to the then method. The first function that is passed to the then method is executed upon success. The second function, if present, is executed upon failure. Since we're not currently using a second function, we're not getting notified of the failure. Let's add a failure handler now. Here, we've added an additional anonymous function that gets a result as a parameter. jQuery actually passes 3 parameters, but the first one is all we really care about. Interestingly enough, the parameter that is passed to us is an object. The result will contain a status text property that describes the nature of the error. We retrieve that and add it to our messages div that has been empty up to this point. Let's see it in action. Now we see that we did, in fact, get an error. Within the poorly worded error message, we finally see that jQuery was unable to load the URI, mostly because it's not defined. Why URI instead of URL? This message comes from the browser. jQuery was trying to load contents based on a URL. It passed the request to the browser, Firefox, which can deal with much more than simple web pages. The acronym URI stands for Uniform Resource Identifier. This is used to reference web pages, images, videos, files, and pretty much any resource available to a computer, tablet, or smartphone. The browser processes in terms of URI, so that's why the error message uses that term instead of URL. Clear? Right. Back to our situation. We're getting our error message when something goes wrong, so our negative testing is doing what we expect. Let's put things back in order and see what happens with this new failure function when we don't expect an error. Here we've changed content-11 back to content-1. We'll run Firefox to see what we get, not expecting an error. As expected, the page loaded properly and we didn't see an error message. The second function was not executed because we had no failures. What happens if we get multiple failures? How many times will the error function be executed? Let's find out. Let's alter 2 of the URLs and see what we get. Here we've changed content-1 back to 11 and content-2 to 22. Let's see what this gives us. As we see, the error function is only executed one time, regardless of how many errors are encountered. We'll look at a way to get around this in just a bit. Using 2 functions as parameters to the then method is a bit confusing to read, and it's not really clear what's going on, especially to the next developer that has to maintain this code. If they aren't familiar with the when-then syntax, they'll have little chance of understanding this code unless they do some research or we add some comments. There is another syntax that makes it much more readable. Instead of placing the failure function as a second parameter to the then method, we can promote it to be on the same level as then by using the fail method. Here's the new pattern. We're using the same anonymous function for failure as before. This time, it's on the same level as the then method. We're using chaining to accomplish this. Chaining methods like this isn't unique to jQuery. It's actually just a core capability of JavaScript. The code reads like this. When the following functions are executed, return a deferred object that can be operated on. Upon success, then execute this function. Upon failure, execute this function. The result of the when method is a deferred object. That object gets passed to the then method, which sets up the handler for success. The then method also returns the same deferred object that gets passed to the fail method to set up the handler for failure. We need to be really clear about something. The when, then, and fail methods all execute almost immediately. There is very little delay between them. What they do is set up event handlers for deferred processing and specify what to do in case of success and failure. The then and fail functions get executed at some time in the future, if ever at all. Let's dig deeper into this deferred object.